Hello Internet, it's Lintus. With tomorrow coming out, I'd like to go on a little trip down memory lane and go through Genshin Impact and how it has changed throughout its almost 2-year run. We'll go through each patch and talk about the things that they added and how it affected the game in a sort of hindsight 2020 sort of way. It will be mostly characters, but we'll also look at some events and some system changes. Now, a couple of disclaimers. This is from the perspective of a low spender turned free-to-play. So, for one, I assume that all 5 stars are at Constellation 0 across the board. I also don't personally own some of the 5 stars, namely the ones that are on the screen right now. I've tried my best to do my research, but ultimately this is second-hand knowledge, so take it with a grain of salt. Also, if it wasn't obvious, I will be talking about power levels and meta and stuff, so if that's not your cup of tea, you can close the video right now, it's fine. And finally, the conclusions that I come to are my opinions, so feel free to disagree or think that I'm wrong, that's fine. And yeah, without further ado, let's get started. So Genshin Impact comes out and it's really big because it's this weird blend of open world exploration with action RPG combat with this very unique elemental reaction system. And while on the surface it was very simple to play, it had a lot of depth and nuance, which we would not discover until much later on. Basically, we didn't know anything about the game because of how unique the reaction system was. One week we were like, oh, look at this Bennett guy, he sucks, look at it damage himself, what a loser, And the next week we would be like, wait, he literally gives you 1000 attack? What? So we were all sort of just learning the game, and we would make a lot of mistakes with like very bad assumptions and stuff. And because this was a gacha game, one of those assumptions is that the rarer 5 stars were just better than the 4 stars. I mean, they're more expensive and they're rarer, right? So everyone was obsessed with Diluc and Keqing, the 2 best DPS in the game. But little did we know that among the 4 stars, 5 of them would be the cornerstones of the meta up until today. Bennett, Xingqiu, Xiangling, Sucrose, Fischl. The big 5. I'm naming them now because I'll be referring to them later in the video. Although a little asterisk on Sucrose, but we'll talk about it more when we get to 1.6. These 4 stars are among the best characters of the game up until today. Not only are they 4 stars, but one of them is free, and some of them have been given out for free during events, and most of them are available in the monthly shop. That's why when you get into this discussion of is Genshin pay to win, is Genshin free to play friendly, it's kind of weird because although you can certainly buy power, some of the most powerful characters in the game are pretty accessible to majority of the player base, even if you are free to play. Just within these 5 characters, you can already form meta teams such as the National Core, that's Bennett, Xingqiu, Xiangling, and then there's also Sucrose Taser, which is Fischl, Beidou, Xingqiu, and Sucrose. In fact, the actual limitations you get for team building in a meta sense is that a lot of teams really want Bennett and Xingqiu. That's why they're considered the 2 best characters in the game. But that's enough about the 4 stars. Let's talk about the 5 stars. The first 2 banner characters introduced to Genshin Impact, Venti and Klee. So let's start with Venti. Venti is an animal bow user, but his real selling point is his burst. Venti's burst trivializes 90% of the content of this game. It has insane CC, it does decent damage with swirls, and it refunds you energy for the party. And that's so much utility in just one burst. Even today, when the content that he does trivializes has become less prevalent, people will still say, when he works, he's broken. Which is true. Venti is indeed broken. Venti will basically be the king of this game for quite a while, basically until Inazuma. Let's move on to Klee. Klee is an on-field pyro carry. Now unfortunately for Klee, it feels like her kit is an uphill battle against the game's mechanics, because see, here's the thing about pyro carries. They really depend on the vaporize reaction to get big damage, that is, hydro plus pyro. But the thing about vaporized teams is that you don't want a lot of pyro. I know that sounds weird, but if you know the mechanics, it's kind of true. You just want enough pyro application to not overtake your hydro application, and you want your pyro application to be your big hits. And Klee has so much pyro application on her normal attacks, on her charge attacks, her skill when it bounces, the mines that her skill leaves behind, her burst which is random how many hits it takes, they all apply pyro. So because of this, it's hard for Klee to properly utilize Vaporize as a reaction. You basically wanted C6 Xingqiu, and this was the start of the game, so not a lot of people had C6 Xingqiu. Klee also had these very long animations that required you to cancel them in order to become safe, which is definitely a barrier of entry to playing Klee. And also, Klee's burst forces you to be on field for 10 seconds and you cannot swap out, otherwise you lose time on her burst. But despite all of these flaws, at the time the perception of Klee was actually pretty good because they were comparing her to Diluc and Keqing. But over time, Klee, Diluc, and Keqing would all be viewed less favorably. And honestly, it's not that big of a deal even if Klee or Diluc or Keqing are not optimal. A lot of characters can clear content just fine even though they're not optimal or they're not meta. So if you want to play these characters, don't be discouraged. Now, the last thing I will say for 1.0 is, remember Elemental Crucible? This was a co-op event where you had to use resin in order to get your rewards. And remember that back then, the resin cap was only 120. 1.1 came, the first patch for Genshin Impact. They finally concluded Liyue's storyline. We got a lot of new characters, 4 of them, Diona and Xinyan, the 4 stars, and Tartaglia and Zhongli, the 5 stars. Let's start with Diona. Diona is a 4-star defensive cryo support. She provides heals and shields, and she's pretty decent at it. She's especially good for new players since she can sort of gap fill a lot of character slots. But since she's a defensive character, you give up a lot of damage for comfort, and if you're doing a lot of the harder content of the game, you're really incentivized to push your damage or optimize your damage. So defensive characters for comfort are not as good. Although let me just say, Hoyoverse hates defensive characters. Diona is kind of an exception to this, but well, we'll get to it. Xinyan is another defensive 4-star. She is Pyro, and she's a Claymore user. Xinyan isn't great. In fact, some people would consider her one of the worst characters in the game. Her biggest problem is that her scaling is all over the place. She has a shield that scales with defense, and it has this weird leveling system that is inconsistent. But her burst is this big physical hit that scales off attack and crit damage. So building her is kind of like, what do you build for? Do you build defense? Do you build attack? Do you build for physical? Do you build for pyro? It's just hard to really make her kit cohesive. Also, having physical on her burst while being pyro is also bad because she's not in one of the elements that provides super contact, which is the main supportive thing for physical units. And also, if you want to use her as a shielder, her shield has downtime. The duration is 12 seconds and the cooldown is 18, although most rotations are 20 to 25 seconds. So yeah, Xinyan, her kit at least, is kind of a mess. But you know, Hoyoverse hates defensive characters. So let's get to the 5 stars. So Tartaglia is a melee bow user. He uses his elemental skill in order to change stances and infuse his auto attacks with Hydro. Now, the roster really needed more Hydro characters. The only Hydro characters at this point were Barbara, Xingqiu, and Mona. So the addition of Tartaglia was much appreciated. He, however, couldn't replace Xingqiu because he had absolutely zero off-field presence. It would take us a while before we could really understand the true value of Tartaglia and how to use him properly. Eventually, we would realize that Hydro application is the glue that holds a lot of teams together, and Tartaglia, while not having any off-field presence, has the highest on-field Hydro application. The one of the things that was confusing about Tartaglia is that while he was only on-field, he wasn't really a carry or, as some people would say, a main DPS. Really, he was a support for Xiangling. If we're sticking to the whole main DPS sub DPS support labels, he's an on-field sub DPS for Xiangling, who is an off-field main DPS. And if that sounds confusing, well, now you know why I don't like these labels. Now, one of Tartaglia's really good teams is International. That's Tartaglia, Xiangling, Bennett, and Kazuha. Although Kazuha is not here yet, so Sucrose can work also. It is one of the most flexible teams in the game. It scales well in AoE but still has decent single target. It has a ton of small mechanics that you can learn in order to optimize your play, such as double swirl setups and rotations that would be different if the enemy already had Riptide applied to them or not. So it's a team with a lot of depth. And finally, let's talk about the Zhongli incident. Zhongli is the Geo Archon and is the defensive character in the game with the biggest shield. Now, Zhongli had very mixed reception. The whale said he was good, the theory crafters say he was underwhelming, and there was a lot of infighting in the community. And eventually there would be enough clamor from the community, especially on the Chinese side, for Hoyoverse to eventually buff Zhongli and the Geo Resonance. I won't really get into it because I don't really have a frame of reference on how bad he was compared to now, because I didn't have him back then. We'll talk about Zhongli when he gets his buffs. But just as a reminder, Hoyoverse hates defensive characters. But, you know what? Let's take a break from all this meta talk and discuss something else. Unreconciled Stars. Unreconciled Stars was the first limited story event of Genshin Impact. It was this side story about dreams and constellations, so there was actually a lot of important lore in it. It was also an event where we saw Official and Mona interact, which was, it's nice to see two characters with distinctive personalities sort of bounce off each other and interact. This event also introduced Scaramouche, and we would not see him until Inazuma. And of course, the line that broke the internet. And all of that was temporary. You can no longer play this event. Because, there wasn't enough FOMO in this game. And it just sucks. It sucks for new players, and it sucks for players that take breaks from the game. It feels so bad, and they would make it worse. But we'll get to that next patch. Anyway, on a lighter note, they did have a couple of quality of life during this patch. We got the resin cap increase, and we also got the ability to condense a resin. We also got a bunch of gadgets, such as the portable waypoint, and the introduction of the city reputation system. We got like wind glider skins and stuff. So that's nice. In 1.2, we got Dragon Spine, which was the first big area that they added to the game. So we got a whole new area to explore. In Dragon Spine, they experimented with environmental hazards with the sheer cold mechanic. They also added a lot more verticality to the exploration of the game. tall mountain with underground caves. And there was also a lot of secrets and a lot of lore tidbits that were hidden in the caves, in the mountain and stuff. So it was good. So let's talk about the characters that were added. Albedo and Ganyu. Albedo is an off-field geo damage dealer. Now, unfortunately for Albedo, Bennett was on his banner, and this was the first time Bennett was on rate up. And at this point, people already knew that Bennett was the best character in the game. Albedo was good, but all he really provided was off-field damage for low investment. At this point, he did not have Cinnabar Spindle, Goro wasn't in the game, nor was Husk of Opulent Dreams. Unfortunately for Albedo, he has split scaling. His elemental skill scales off of defense, while his elemental burst scales off of attack. Now with Albedo came his story event, and with that came the first event exclusive weapon, the Festering Desire. Yep, more FOMO. I told you it will get worse. The weapons that they've given out so far in these limited events are decent, and especially for new players that don't have a lot of weapons yet, it's a pretty good alternative. Fortunately, it's not the best in slot for many of the characters, with one very notable exception, but we'll get to it. Anyway, I don't see why they just don't add some sort of way for new players to get the event weapons, especially the really old ones such as Festering Desire. They did add ways for new players to get the event exclusive gadgets such as the Summer Balloon one. And maybe you can say because the event exclusive weapon is tied to a story and they've already committed to not rerunning story events, that's the reason why. Just rerun the event. Just rerun the story event. If you don't want to make it permanent, at least do some reruns. Ugh. So let's talk about Ganyu. Ganyu is the big one. The one that powercrept the previous DPSs. The most broken, best DPS that is way better than Klee, Diluc, and Keqing. Yes, these three. Definitely the most meta and best DPS in the game previously, but now it's Ganyu. Except, is she though? Did she actually power creep the game? Because as we discussed before, Klee, Diluc, and Keqing weren't the best in the game. It was Bennett, Xingqiu, and Xiangling. Well, actually there's Venti as well. Ganyu only power creeps the game if you stick to that assumption that 5 stars are inherently better than 4 stars, which is not true for Genshin. Now while Ganyu is not more powerful than the big 5, she is around their power level. Which means that Ganyu isn't power creep, she's just a sort of correction. You see, after Ganyu, most if not all of the 5 stars are better than the new 4 stars. Of course, the big 5 are still among the best, and you can argue there are some outliers here and there, but Ganyu is just the result of their adjustment to the balancing of the game. So Ganyu didn't power creep the game, it's just that the designers got better at making 5 stars. There was also this comparison floating around in the community where Ganyu was just Cryo Amber. But you know what? It's okay. They won't do this again. I'm sure people on the internet are gonna learn their lesson and not reduce a character to saying, oh, this character is just that character. And then people are gonna misjudge it and then misevaluate a character and maybe pull, maybe not pull and regret it. I'm sure it's never, ever going to happen again. Oh yeah, let's talk about Ganyu herself. Ganyu is a flexible 5-star cryo carry with both on-field and off-field capabilities, and Ganyu can form a freeze team and a melt team. Now, unfortunately, freeze Ganyu is somewhat dependent on 5-star supports, namely Venti and Mona. Venti is there to group the enemies, provide VV Shred, and enable Ganyu's quadratic scaling on her burst. And Mona because, well, again, our only Hydro options were Barbara, Xingqiu, Tartaglia, and Mona. And among these, Mona is the best option. Melt Ganyu wasn't very prominent at the time, since its niche is single target. Bosses wouldn't come to the Spiral Abyss until much later, and it's also a bit counterintuitive to play since Ganyu has to charge up her shots very close to the enemies. So that was Ganyu. It really felt like if you weren't a whale or a dolphin at the time, her effectiveness was a bit hampered because you didn't have access to the 5-star supports. In this patch, they also added 2 new artifact sets, the Blizzard Strayer and the Heart of Depths. The 2-piece effects on the new artifact sets was really needed because we were missing that particular 2-piece effect. Let's start with Blizzard Strayer. Blizzard Strayer made Freeze Comms top meta. 40 crit rate is so much stats just to give away, and this is usually played alongside Cryo Resonance, which is an additional 15. Freeze teams already had this very valuable utility in freezing the enemies, so you don't have to interact with enemies. We all know how annoying Genshin enemies are, and Blizzard Strayer gives these teams damage on top of that utility. And because of the limitations to team building, attack percent is actually sought after in these teams, so don't ignore attack percent. So moving on to Heart of Depth. Heart of Depth is the Hydro artifact set, and it is good on Tartaglia, but maybe not as much as people think. While it is technically his best set, it's not that much better than 2-piece Heart of Depth, 2-piece Gladiator. This is because during AoE, Tartaglia's damage is actually evenly spread among his normal attacks, his Riptides, and his burst. So yeah, that was most of 1.2. But as a last footnote for this patch, remember Hypostatic Symphony? This was the first combat event that sort of was the challenge event, where we got to fight special versions of the Hypostasis bosses. And there were modifiers that were buffed to the enemy or debuffed to you. Some of them were really annoying, like 100% cooldown and 80% less energy, stuff like that. 1.3k and it was our first Lantern Rite. We got to play Theater Mechanicus for the first time, and we got a free 4-star Liyue character, and people were kind of underwhelmed because the playable characters weren't in the actual game world, they were only in the cutscenes. In this patch, they also added the Geo Bishop and the Primo Geo Bishop, which were Geo enemies that absorbed elements, like Anemo characters. Weird. And these were our banners. Yup, just these two. There is definitely not a third banner in between them that we do not talk about ever. So let's talk about the 2 new characters, Xiao and Hu Tao. Xiao is an Anemo hyper carry centered around his plunge attack. He's a pretty good addition to the roster. I would categorize him in the non-VV carry. VV, of course, is the very powerful Viridescent Veneris set that reduces enemies' resistance if you can swirl that element, but of course Anemo cannot swirl itself, so to compensate they gave him really high multipliers. Since he only really needs a battery in order to get his burst back, his teams tend to be very flexible because you're only taking 1 slot for the battery and you have 2 slots to do whatever you want, just as long as those slots don't take away too much field time. Also, because he's a typically supportive element, he can also have teams where he supports his supports. For example, he can carry VV himself in order to boost the damage of his off-field damage dealers, and there's also an option of giving him the Favonius Lance. This lowers his personal damage, but he can provide energy for his teams, and it also opens up the possibility of not needing a dedicated battery. Okay, so moving on to Hu Tao. Hu Tao is an on-field 5-star pyro carry. She has a very high skill ceiling with her animation cancels. She has a self-damaging infusion in her elemental skill, and she's incentivized to be at low HP. This also means that she has anti-synergy with Bennett, which is to say Bennett is still overall a positive addition to her team, it's just that it's probably better to have Bennett on the other team. She's also highly dependent on Vaporize for her damage, and thus, team building, she is tied to Xingqiu. Xingqiu is the best candidate for this because he's the only one that can provide enough off-field hydro application for her. Her teams can go either of two ways, either double Geo or VV Vape. The double Geo one is more comfy and more popular. This is Zhongli and Albedo. Zhongli provides a very beefy shield that protects her, especially since she goes low HP, and then she uses her stamina for charge attacks, so it's harder to dodge. However, if you have both Zhongli's Pillar and Albedo's Blooms hitting the enemy, they will eventually react with the Hydro and eat away at the aura. And if ever Hu Tao does a charge attack and there is no Hydro on the enemy, then Hu Tao will apply the Pyro, and now it's Xingqiu the one that's vaporizing. And Hu Tao has a very hard time sort of resetting the applications where she's the one that's vaping again, so it might just be that Hu Tao will just lose damage for the rest of the rotation. As for the other team, VV Vape, it has a much higher damage ceiling, but it also is harder to play and requires more knowledge. Basically, this team adds an Anemo character for the VV Shred. However, the issue now is Hu Tao doesn't have an easy way to apply Pyro without using her Fusion, and you want your Infusion for your DPS window, right? So that usually means you need a second Pyro character in order for the VV setup, which means you're not running Zhongli because all your character slots are filled up. Now, they would add things on later patches in order to make a certain forgotten character viable in Hu Tao VV Vape. And that forgotten character is Elegy of the End Amber. That's right, Amber has a meta team. Amber is really good at proccing Elegy of the End, and the buff is really good for Hu Tao VV Vape. Amber is also Pyro, which means she can provide the Pyro in order for the VV setup. This does mean that you're not running a shielder at all. So this is Hu Tao VV Vape peak optimization. Now, alongside Hu Tao was the Staff of Homa. This was the first 5-star weapon that was tailor-made for the accompanying 5-star character. And it was pretty good, maybe a little bit too good, because it's really good on Hu Tao, and it's pretty good on everyone else. But Weapon Banner's a scam. Speaking of a scam, they added 4-star limited weapons to the Weapon Banner, the Lithic series. And I don't really have much to say other than kinda sucks that they added more things that aren't in the general pool. The general pool kinda sucks for Genshin. It's very stagnant. And of course, this was the patch where the Zhongli buffs were implemented. So Zhongli became good. Begrudgingly, Hoyoverse gave us a good defensive character. He's a pretty good character for comfort, but not so much increasing your damage. While his shield does shred resistance, and paired with the Geo Resonance buff, it is a nice bonus to your damage. But the issue is Zhongli himself has to choose between building for his shield or building for damage. And even if he does build for damage, it's not that high. So while I think Zhongli is a pretty good character and he's a good addition to the roster, I really feel that he's being held back by Geo not having any supportive capabilities. Oh well, okay, there is one, and that's Archaic Petra. And Archaic Petra is decent, but it does have a couple of issues. One is the placement of the crystal is RNG, so it can be a real hassle to actually get the crystal to get your buff. The second is the buff is bonus damage, which is not as good as VV's resistance shred. And the killer is Genshin shields do not stack. So you're just getting the crystal for the buff if you're using Archaic Petra Zhongli. So yeah, that was the Zhongli buff. He's good for comfort and not damage. Now, before we leave 1.3, a few footnotes. They finally gave us more fragile resin as Battle Pass rewards. They added a very important gadget, the camera. This patch also had the very first leyline overflow. And finally, Barbara became sad.
Let the show begin! Let the show begin.
1.4 came and we got another festival, this time in Mondstadt. It was the Windblume festival. We got back-to-back festivals. You get to dodge bubbles? People were saying this was like Fall Guys. And we got our first rhythm game. We also got the very first reruns of the game, which was Venti and Tartaglia. We also got a new 4-star in Rosaria. Rosaria was another good generalist cryo character, very similar to Kea. There were some differences here and there, but they were both around the same power level. And also, they were good together. Together, they could form a lot of quick swap teams, which made use of their low cooldown. They could do freeze quick swap and reverse melt quick swap. Unfortunately, Rosaria would be the last good 4-star we'll see in a long while. Another thing that came in this patch is Elegy of the End. It was our first support 5-star weapon. Unfortunately, it was a bit underwhelming until we get to 1.6. And as for the other stuff that happened in this patch, we finally got an Archon quest that furthered the plot of the Traveler and the Abyss Twin. We got to meet Dainsleif, and we also saw the introduction of the Abyss Herald, which had this giant shield check at the end. And when they added him to the Spiral Abyss, Chongyun saw a bump in his usage. And finally, the introduction of Hangout events. In 1.5, we got 2 new characters, Yanfei and Eula. Yanfei is a 4-star on-field pyro carry. She is very similar to Klee, but she also has a mechanic like Ningguang, where you do normal attacks in order to make your charge attack stronger. Unfortunately for her, she inherits a lot of the problems with Klee, that there's just some parts in her kit that add a little bit more pyro application than what you want. So it can be a bit inconsistent whether or not you vaporize your charge attacks, which is her big hits. One of her constellations, the C4 one, does give her a different build, where you can build her as a shielder rather than an on-field pyro carry. I'm not really sure how effective this is, I haven't tried it personally, but it is sort of unique. It's rare that the constellation completely changes a character. And then we have Eula, a 5-star physical on-field carry who has this massive hit on her burst. She's in the same boat as Xiao, the non-VP carries. Unfortunately, I think more than any other carry, she's plagued with a lot of gameplay issues. For example, because her burst explodes after 7 seconds, her damage is backloaded, which is not always very good in Genshin Impact. Also, in this 7-second window, Eula needs to do her combos and she cannot get interrupted or dodge. And because the majority of her damage is on her burst, if it doesn't crit or the enemies dodge with invul or just get out of the way of the AoE, it feels really bad. She also has a lot of bad matchups in enemies. The Spiral Abyss has not been kind to her. Any enemy with high physical resistance is obviously bad for her, so Ruin Guards, those Doritos, Perpetual Mechanical Array are all kind of bad matchups. Also, high mobility and enemies with invulnerability frames are also bad for her because she doesn't control when her burst explodes, and she has energy problems, exacerbated by the fact that she cannot properly funnel her energy because of her burst animation. So she needs both a battery and energy recharge. She also has a couple of team building restrictions. She needs 1 cryo for the battery and she needs 1 electro for superconduct. So because you're already occupying 3 slots, shield breaking can be a problem. Can be. I think hydro and electro shields are fine, but pyro and cryo shields are a problem. It's also hard to fit in crowd control in her teams because most crowd controls are Animo and the VV does work on her. Freeze is actually a funny consideration since Eula shatters with her normal attacks, but it's still some sort of CC? I kinda like it actually. So yeah, I have very mixed feelings on her design. I find her fun to play on the overworld and on the lower floors of Spiral Abyss, and really frustrating to play on floor 12. This patch also introduced us to new artifact sets, the Tenacity of the Millilith and the Pale Flame set. The Tenacity of the Millilith set is a support artifact for characters that have a persistent off-field elemental skill. Also, I think this is the first artifact set that actually works off-field. Support artifacts are kinda rare, there's only really Noblesse Oblige. There's actually good support sets in the 4-star category, but because they're 4 stars, your character needs to be able to afford the substat loss in order to use them. And the Pale Flame set is just a better physical artifact set than Bloodstained Chivalry, just because the condition is much easier to obtain. Although it is made for Eula, other physical carries can use it. We also got Zhongli's second story quest in this patch, and Ajax as a weekly boss. Ajax is the 4th weekly boss to be added to Genshin Impact, and it is here that they introduced the discount for the first 3 weekly bosses that we did. And other stuff in this patch was the Misty Dungeon. This was the first combat event where we got trial characters. So we got to try out characters outside their really dumb test run. There was also the first wind trace. This is also the patch where they added Serenity Pot, which is definitely a good addition. I just don't have anything to say about it. So, 1.6, the last patch before Inazuma. We got the Golden Apple Archipelago, which was this giant area, just like Dragon Spine, to explore, which was temporary. We also got Vagabond, the Legend of the Vagabond Sword, which to this day is the hardest combat event in Genshin. And of course, we got Kazuha. But before we get to Kazuha himself, let's talk about the Elemental Mastery buffs. In 1.6, they changed the transformative reactions, which are Electrocharge, Superconduct, Overload, Swirl, and Shatter. They would increase the scaling of damage on characters with higher levels, as well as increasing the scaling of Elemental Mastery itself. This meant that characters that did a lot of reaction damage were incentivized to build all the way to level 90 and build full EM, and the characters that were already doing so were much better. But before this change was even implemented, people were already saying that this will be the Electro buff that we were all waiting for. Now, we'll talk about this more when we get to 2.1 when Raiden comes out, but I'm pointing this out to illustrate that the community perception of Electro was already going down. However, the most buffed character by this change was Sucrose. Not only did she do a lot of reaction damage with her swirls, but she also shared her EM, which just made her teams way better. And perhaps this is the turning point for her in the meta, and that's why I had to put an asterisk on her when I mentioned that she was part of the Big Five. It's hard to know exactly how good she was before this change, because she was just overshadowed by Venti, but definitely after the EM changes, Sucrose became one of the best characters in the game. So speaking of Sucrose, Kazuha is basically 5-star Sucrose. This is not an inaccurate description, but it did mislead a lot of people. And perhaps there were other reasons, such as Venti still being the king of this game, and people were also saving for Inazuma characters, but the perception of him at the time was, oh, he's not a must-pull, because he's just 5-star Sucrose, and you already have a Sucrose. But the perception of him would change drastically once Inazuma came out. Venti would be dethroned, some Inazuma characters would have mixed reception, and we would discover just how good those EM buffs were. So the regret of not pulling Kazuha was amplified. And alongside Kazuha was his story in order to set up the events for Inazuma. Inazuma would be the first big region to be added to Genshin since its release. And with the Land of Eternity comes hostility, disappointment, character interactions not working. Should be fun. Hey, that was the video. Thank you for watching. This was a bit longer than I had anticipated. If you made it this far, I hope you had fun with the video. And yeah, have a great day.